This story is about the haunted delivery at midnight. It was the kind of night that felt like it would never end. I was assigned a late-night delivery, nothing out of the ordinary, just a regular order for a small apartment complex on the outskirts of town. The air was cold, and the streetlights flickered like dying embers, casting long shadows along the narrow, empty streets. I was used to these late-night gigs, but this one felt different. I pulled up to the complex, the dim light from the street lamps barely reaching the parking lot. The address was odd, at the very end of the street, where the buildings seemed to lean into each other, almost like they were hiding something. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I grabbed the package from the back of my van. There was a strange sense of urgency in my movements, a feeling I couldn't shake. The building was quiet, too quiet. As I approached the front door, I noticed something odd about the windows. They were all covered with thick curtains, the kind that were impossible to see through. Normally, I'd have a quick conversation with the resident, but tonight, I had an eerie feeling that something was off. I rang the doorbell. No answer. I rang again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. I checked my phone, the delivery was confirmed. The instructions said to leave it at the door if no one answered, but something told me not to leave just yet. There was a chill in the air, colder than it should have been for a late spring night. I looked around, and for the first time, I noticed something strange about the building. Every other apartment had lights on, but the one I was at, it was pitch dark. I knocked once more, this time harder, as if the door could open on its own if I just tried hard enough. Suddenly, the door creaked open just a crack. My heart skipped a beat. A faint voice came from inside. "You're here," the voice whispered. I didn't recognize the person, but I didn't have time to think about it. I placed the package down and stepped back, but the door didn't shut immediately. It lingered, as if waiting for me to do something. I backed away, my eyes still on the door, which now seemed to be slowly opening wider, just enough for me to see a figure standing inside, barely visible in the dim light. "I'll be back tomorrow," I said, turning to leave. But something stopped me. From the corner of my eye, I saw a flash, something moving across the window, but it wasn't the person who had spoken. It was a shadow, tall and thin, something that didn't belong. I turned around quickly, but the door slammed shut. My heart pounded in my chest, and a wave of cold terror washed over me. I shook my head, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. The night had been strange, but nothing could prepare me for what happened next. I hurried back to my van, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with every step. As I started the engine, I saw something that made my blood run cold. From the upstairs window of the apartment, a pale face was staring down at me. It wasn't the person who had opened the door. This face was older, with hollow eyes that seemed to follow my every movement. It was as if they were silently watching, waiting for something. I quickly drove away, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. But the feeling of dread didn't leave. It followed me all the way back to the delivery hub, lingering in the back of my mind like a dark cloud. As I parked the van, my phone buzzed. It was a message from the app: "Delivery successfully completed. Please leave a review." I stared at the screen in disbelief. That was impossible. I had just delivered the package, and there was no way the app would confirm it before I even left. A wave of nausea hit me, and I tried to call the customer to confirm. But the number was disconnected. The next day, I found out the truth. The apartment I had delivered to didn't exist on the records, there was no one by that name in the system, and the address didn't show up on any maps. The building, in fact, had been abandoned for years, ever since a tragic event occurred there. The residents had all disappeared, and no one had ever been able to explain what had happened. I was haunted by that night, unable to shake the image of the shadow in the window. The paranormal events that unfolded have stuck with me, a chilling reminder of how quickly reality can slip into a nightmare. This story is about the creepy delivery to the abandoned house. It started as just another late-night delivery. The route was quiet, the roads empty, the only sound being the hum of my van's engine. I had been working as a delivery driver for a few years now, and nothing could really scare me anymore. Or so I thought. The order was placed in the middle of nowhere, a rural area with few houses and no neighbors. The address led me to a desolate part of town, where the pavement crumbled and the streetlights were few and far between. The GPS wasn't much help either, showing the location as a large, old house at the end of a long, winding driveway. I had my doubts. The place looked abandoned, with overgrown weeds surrounding the front yard and windows that were covered in grime. The paint on the house had long since peeled away, leaving behind a ghostly, decaying structure that sent an unsettling chill through me. Still, I had a job to do, so I turned onto the narrow road and drove up to the house. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. The silence was suffocating, and the air felt unnaturally still. I tried ringing the bell. Still nothing. I glanced around, wondering if I had made a mistake. But then, just as I was about to turn around and leave, I heard something, soft, almost like a whisper coming from inside the house. "Come in." My heart skipped a beat. I didn't recognize the voice. It was soft, eerie, almost like a breathless murmur. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my instinct screamed for me to get out of there. But, as a delivery driver, it was my job to ensure the package got to its destination. I swallowed my fear and pushed the door open, stepping into the darkness. The house was cold, colder than it should have been, and the air felt heavy. The floors creaked under my feet as I moved cautiously through the house. The walls were lined with old, dusty portraits, their eyes seeming to follow me as I walked. I looked down the hallway, there were no lights on, and the entire house seemed frozen in time. The voice came again, faint but clear. "Leave the package on the table." I followed the voice, which led me into what looked like a living room, though the furniture was old and covered in sheets. At the center of the room was an antique wooden table, and I carefully placed the package down. But as I did, I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The temperature dropped further, and I could feel a presence in the room with me, something I couldn't explain. Just as I turned to leave, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, movement. A shadow. It was fleeting, like a figure darting across the room. I froze. I wasn't alone. I turned around quickly, expecting to see someone standing there. But there was no one. The room was empty, just as I had seen it when I entered. My heart raced, and my breath grew shallow. Something wasn't right. I backed away slowly, my eyes scanning the room, but it was as if the house itself was watching me. As I reached the door, the whisper came again. "Don't leave." I spun around, but the voice was gone. I stood there for a moment, terrified, unsure of what to do. Something was wrong with this place, but I couldn't leave. I felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear, unable to move. Finally, I snapped out of it and bolted out of the house, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't stop running until I was back in the van, and even then, I kept my eyes locked on the dark windows of the house, certain that someone, or something, was watching me. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just encountered something paranormal. The house had been abandoned for years, and yet, I had felt a presence there, something dark and ancient, like the house was holding on to the memories of its past, or worse, something trapped inside. The next day, I looked up the address out of curiosity. There was no record of anyone living there for decades, and no news of any deliveries to that house in years. But the most unsettling part was finding out that the house had once been the site of a tragedy. Several people had died there under mysterious circumstances, their deaths never fully explained. I never made another delivery to that house, but the memory of that night still haunts me. The voice, the shadow, the feeling that I wasn't alone. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that something is still waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to step inside. This story is about the cursed package. It was a normal day, or at least I thought it was. The morning started off routine, delivering packages to a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside the city. But everything changed when I picked up a certain package. It was an old wooden crate, heavy and marked with strange symbols I couldn't recognize. The shipping label had no name, just an address and a set of coordinates that seemed completely random. The feeling in my gut, that sensation of something being wrong, grew stronger as I loaded the crate into my van. I tried to ignore it. After all, I was just a delivery driver doing my job. What could possibly go wrong? The address led me to an eerie part of town, an old street filled with houses that looked abandoned, with weeds growing in the yards and windows boarded up. When I pulled up to the house on the corner, my heart sank. It was a large, decrepit mansion, its windows dark and uninviting. There was no one in sight, not a car or any movement inside. It looked like a place that hadn't seen a visitor in years. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. I hesitated, my hand still on the wooden crate. Something about this place didn't feel right. There was an unnatural stillness in the air, like the house itself was holding its breath. But I pushed those feelings aside and set the crate down on the front porch. I had done it countless times before, but this time, my instinct screamed at me to leave. I turned to go back to the van, but that's when the door creaked open, just a crack. I froze. The only thing visible from the shadows was a pair of hands, pale, bony, and thin, reaching out, dragging the package inside without a word. I tried to peer inside, but the door slammed shut before I could see who, or what, was behind it. My heart raced, and I quickly stepped back, my skin crawling as an overwhelming sense of dread filled the air. I didn't know why, but I felt as if something was terribly wrong. I got into the van and left as quickly as I could, shaking off the uneasy feeling that gripped me. But the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't shake the image of those hands. There was something unnatural about them, like they didn't belong to any living person. I tried to push the thought aside, focusing on the rest of my deliveries. But that night, as I lay in bed, the strange occurrences began. It started with a soft tapping at my window. I thought it was the wind, maybe a branch brushing against the glass. But then the tapping came again, louder this time. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate, like someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. I pulled back the curtains and looked out into the street. There was nothing there, just the empty road and the quiet houses. I brushed it off as my imagination playing tricks on me, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I dreamt of the mansion. The house was dark and cold, the air thick with an unnatural fog. I could hear whispers, faint and distant, but always just out of reach. I tried to run, to escape, but every time I turned a corner, I ended up right back in front of that front door. I could hear it now, the unmistakable sound of those pale hands, tapping on the door, beckoning me inside. The next few nights were the same. The nightmares became more intense, more vivid. The whispers in my dreams grew louder, urging me to return to the house. I felt a strange compulsion to go back, but I knew I shouldn't. I was terrified, but at the same time, there was something pulling me in. I couldn't explain it. It was as if the house had a hold on me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go back. I had to know what was happening, why I kept dreaming about that place. Maybe if I confronted whatever was there, I could put an end to it. So, one night, against my better judgment, I returned to the mansion. The house stood eerily silent as I approached. The windows were dark, and the front door was ajar. I didn't think twice. I walked up to the door and stepped inside. The air inside was cold, colder than it should have been, and the silence was suffocating. The walls were covered in dust, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. But it wasn't just the house that was strange, it was the feeling, the sensation that something was waiting for me. Something, watching me. I walked through the house, every room darker than the last. The silence was oppressive, and it felt like every step I took was being observed. I could feel it in my bones. When I reached the living room, that's when I saw it. A figure, standing by the window. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its features were twisted, like a grotesque mask. Its face was distorted, its eyes dark and hollow, like empty voids. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, unable to react. The figure turned to face me, and its mouth opened in a silent scream. It was as if it wanted to say something but couldn't. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was seeing. This wasn't just a ghost, it was something far worse, something twisted and angry, something that had been trapped in this house for far too long. I tried to move, to run, but I was rooted to the spot. The figure reached out, its long fingers stretching toward me. The room seemed to darken, the shadows growing deeper, and I could feel an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. This thing, whatever it was, didn't want me to leave. I forced myself to turn and run, my legs carrying me back to the door as fast as I could. But when I reached the threshold, the door slammed shut in my face. I was trapped. The figure was now standing in front of me, its hollow eyes boring into mine. The whispers started again, this time louder, surrounding me, drowning me in their insistent call. I knew then that I wasn't just dealing with a haunted house. I was dealing with something far darker, a force that had latched onto me ever since that package. With all my strength, I broke free, slamming my shoulder into the door, sending it flying open. I didn't look back as I ran to my van, my heart pounding in my chest. But even as I drove away, the feeling of those hollow eyes on my back never left me. I never went back to that street. I never spoke of it again, but sometimes, at night, I hear the faint tapping on my window. And when I close my eyes, I still see that figure, waiting for me, calling me back to the place where it all began.